Hello, and welcome. Come, find a comfortable place to rest your weary head. Perhaps imagine yourself seated at the base of a colossal oak tree, its roots gnarled and covered in soft emerald moss, ancient enough to have witnessed the very histories we are about to explore. Let the noise of the modern world fade away, replaced by the rustling of leaves in a gentle breeze and the soft, rhythmic breathing of the forest around you. Close your eyes and let your mind drift backward, back through the currents of time, past the rise of humans, past the fall of Netheril, deep into the mists of history where the world was young, and the elves ruled supreme. Today, we begin a journey into one of the most tragic, complex, and foundational eras of the Forgotten Realms. We are going to speak of the Crown Wars. This is not merely a story of battles and swords. It is the saga of a fractured soul, the breaking of a people who were once one. It is the history of how the Telquessa, the people, tore themselves apart and reshaped the face of Faerûn forever. To understand the horror of the Crown Wars, you must first understand the beauty that preceded it. You must visualize the world as it was around 12,000 years before daily reckoning. This era is known to scholars and lore keepers as the first flowering. It was the golden age of the Elves. Imagine the continent of Faerûn not as a patchwork of human kingdoms, roads and deforested plains, but as a nearly unbroken sea of green. The great forests covered almost everything. From the spine of the world in the north to the Shire in the south, the trees held dominion. In this verdant paradise, the elves had established 5 great civilizations, nations of such magical prowess and aesthetic perfection that their ruins today are still marvels of the world. Let us walk through these nations so you understand what was lost. First, in the north, located in what we now know as the High Forest, stood Arivandar. This was the realm of the Gold Elves, or the Ar Telquessa. They were the Sun Elves, visualized their cities not as stone fortresses, but as soaring spires of white marble and living wood, shaped by high magic to catch the light of the sun. Arivandar was a place of rigid hierarchy, immense magical scholarship, and breathtaking beauty. The Sun Elves believed themselves to be the chosen leaders of Elvenkind, the closest to the Seldarine. The Elven pantheon, their crest was the peacock, a symbol of their radiant, if somewhat vain, glory. They valued order, tradition, and the preservation of high magic above all else. To the west of Arivandar, along the Sword Coast and encompassing the lands we now call the High Moor, lay Mirita. This was a nation primarily of green elves, the Sai Telquessi, and dark elves, the Esrai Telquessia. Unlike the rigid, sun-drenched spires of Arivandar, Mirita was a realm of harmony with nature. Their cities were grown from the forest itself, woven into the canopy. They were a people of art, song, and deep druidic magic. While Arivandar sought to order the world, Mirita sought to flow with it. The dark elves here were not the Drow we know today. They were brown-skinned warriors and artists, passionate and fierce, living side by side with their green elf kin. Far to the south, in the steaming jungles and forests of the Shire and beyond, was Ilithia. This was the primary stronghold of the Dark Elves. The Ilithieri were a powerful, expansive people. They were darker of heart than their northern cousins, perhaps, but they were not yet monsters. They were conquerors, fierce in battle, worshipping older, primal aspects of the elven gods. Their cities were sprawling complexes of stone and vine, rich with the plunder of their expansions. They were the neighbors everyone watched with a wary eye, for their ambition was naked and unashamed. Between these giants lay two other significant realms, Chantal Othraia nestled in the Greenlands, a nation of peace-loving green elves who wished only for isolation and tranquility. And along the southern coast, near modern Tethir and Ammon, rose Keltormir, a wise and powerful coalition of moon elves and green elves, seeking a middle path between the arrogance of the north and the aggression of the south. For thousands of years, these nations existed in a state of relative balance. There were skirmishes. Yes, there were disputes over borders and resources, but the concept of total war, of the annihilation of one elf by another, as alien, it was an unthinkable taboo. To kill one's kin was to wound the Seldrain itself. But rot often begins in the most beautiful of fruits. The catalyst for the catastrophe that would span 3,000 years was found in the gleaming heart of Aravandar. It began with a single noble family, the Vaishanta. The Vaishanta were not merely a political faction, they were an ideology made flesh. They looked out from their high towers in the high forest and saw a disorderly world. They saw the chaotic growth of Mierita, the savage expansion of Ilithia, and the passive isolation of Chantal Othraia. To the Vaishanta, this separation of the Elven people was a weakness. They believed, with a terrifying zealous conviction, that the destiny of the Telquasir was to be united under a single banner. And, naturally, they believed that banner should be the peacock of Aravandar. This philosophy was seductive. It was not presented as tyranny, but as benevolence. Who could argue against unity? Who could argue against bringing the enlightenment of Sun Elf culture to the lesser subraces? The coronal of Aravandar, Vaivazar Vaisham, the ambitious patriarch of the clan, began to speak of a pan-elven empire. He spoke of a world where all elves answered to the Golden Throne, where the chaotic magic of the wild was tamed by the high magic of the sun. Around 12,000 Doctor, the diplomatic maneuvering began. It was subtle at first. Aravandar sent emissaries to Mierita, offering trade agreements that were essentially economic shackles. They offered protection pacts that required the stationing of Aravandar troops within Mierita borders. The leaders of Mierita, wise to the arrogance of their northern neighbors, politely but firmly declined. They valued their independence. They valued their specific connection to the land, which was different from the arcane mastery of the Sun Elves. This rejection was the spark the Vaishanta had been waiting for. It allowed them to paint Mierita not just as a neighbor, but as an obstacle to elven progress. The propaganda within Aravandar shifted. The green and dark elves of Mierita were painted as backward, ungrateful, and culturally inferior. The Vaishanta historians began to dig, or perhaps manufacture, genealogical claims. They produced ancient scrolls claiming that the ruling line of Mierita was actually a cadet branch of the Aravandar royal family, and therefore the coronal of Aravandar was the rightful high king of both realms. You can see how the tension tightened, like a bowstring drawn too far. The atmosphere in the high forest changed. The songs of the bards in Aravandar stopped celebrating the beauty of nature and began celebrating the glory of conquest. The high mages, the Selutar, began to research spells, not for building or healing, but for destruction on a massive scale. This was a perversion of the art, a twisting of the gift of magic given by Corellon Larethian. In Mierita, the The mood was one of growing dread. They saw the gathering storm. They sent messengers to Chantal Othria and Keltamir, pleading for a defensive alliance. But the other nations hesitated. They did not want to provoke the wrath of the Golden Army. They believed, naively, that this was a localized dispute, a squabble between brothers that would resolve itself with words. They were wrong. The Vaishanta Empire, now fully under the sway of its militant expansionists, issued a final ultimatum to Mieritar. Submit to the rule of the Vaishanta Coronal, dismantle your independent government, and accept the guidance of Arivandal, or face the consequences. Mieritar refused. They could do nothing else. To submit was to erase their culture, their identity, their very soul. And so, in the year -12,000, the unthinkable happened. The First Crown War did not begin with a declaration of honor. It began with a surprise offensive. The gleaming legions of Arivandal, clad in golden armor and backed by the terrifying power of high magic, marched south. They crossed the borders not as diplomats, but as invaders. This conflict, which history would name the First Crown War or the War of the Usurpation, was shocking in its brutality. For the first time in recorded memory, elf struck down elf, with the intent to kill. The verdant woods of Mieritar were stained with blood. The peaceful glades where druids once sang to the trees became battlefields where lightning and fire tore the earth apart. The shockwave of this violence rippled across Faerûn. In the south, the dark elves of Ilithir watched with a mixture of horror and opportunistic calculation. In the west, Keltamir barred its gates. The Seldarine, the gods themselves, wept in Avondor, for they saw what their children had started, and they knew, with divine foresight, that this was only the beginning of the sorrow. The aggression of Arivandal was not just a military campaign. It was a cultural assertion. As their armies advanced, they didn't just occupy territory. They sought to rewrite history. They destroyed the libraries of Mieritar. They felled sacred groves. They imposed the Sun Elf dialect and customs upon the conquered populace. It was a systematic attempt to prove their ideology correct by force, that there was only one true way to be an elf, and that was the Vaishanta way. However, Mieritar was not a nation of weaklings. Though they lacked the sheer arcane firepower of the Sun Elves, they knew their land. They used the dense forests to their advantage, launching guerrilla strikes, fading into the shadows, and bleeding the Golden Army for every inch of ground. The war that the Vaishanta hoped would be a swift annexation turned into a grinding, bitter conflict that would last for centuries. This is where we find ourselves at the outset of this saga. The paradise is fractured, the line has been crossed. The first flowering is beginning to wilt, its petals scorched by the fires of ambition. The Aravandai Empire has revealed its true face, a mask of gold hiding a heart of iron. And in the shadows of the south, the Ilithir are sharpening their blades, realizing that if the rules of civilization have been broken by the noble Sun Elves, then perhaps there are no rules left at all. As we move forward into the next section, we will look deeper into the specifics of this First Crown War. We will examine the fall of Mieritar, the desperate resistance of its people, and the false peace that settled over the north, a peace that was nothing more than the silence of a graveyard. Take a moment now to absorb the weight of this history. The pride of the Vaishanta was the stone that started the avalanche. And as we shall see, the avalanche crushes everything in its path, regardless of innocence or guilt. Let the image of that pristine ancient forest remain in your mind. But now, allow the skies above it to darken. We are moving from the era of peace into the era of the First Crown War. Breathe slowly. You are safe here, watching from the distance of history, protected by the veil of time. We ended our last chapter with the rise of the Vaishanta family in Eravandar and their growing hunger for dominion. Now, we must look closely at the mechanism of their betrayal. It is important to understand that the First Crown War was not initially presented as a war of conquest. Tyrants rarely announce themselves as tyrants. Instead, it was presented as a matter of law, a matter of family restoration. The year was 12,000. The coronal of Eravandar, Ivazar Vaisham, stood before the Council of High Mages and produced documents that had supposedly been unearthed from the deepest archives of the capital. These scrolls, written in an archaic dialect of Esprua, outlined a lineage that connected the ruling families of Mieritar directly to the royal line of Eravandar. The argument was subtle and insidious. The Vaishanta claimed that thousands of years prior, a younger brother of a past Eravandar coronal had travelled west to found Mieritar. Therefore, by the laws of primogeniture, the right of the firstborn, Mieritar was not a sovereign nation at all. It was a vassal state, a wayward province that had forgotten its allegiance to the Golden Throne. This claim was, by most scholarly accounts of later eras, a fabrication. It was a lie wrapped in the finery of legalese, but in the courts of Eravandar, where the Vaishanta family held absolute sway over the political narrative, it became the truth. Diplomatic envoys were dispatched to the High Court of Mieritar. Imagine the scene: the tall, gold-skinned ambassadors of the north, draped in shimmering silks and radiating the aura of high magic, standing before the wilder, more earthen leaders of the green and dark elves of Mieritar. The ambassadors did not draw weapons. They simply presented the evidence and politely requested that the coronal of Mieritar step down to the rank of duke and pledge fealty to Eravandar. The outrage in Mieritar was absolute. To them, this was not just an insult. It was a negation of their entire history. They rejected the claim with a vehemence that shook the leaves of their forest cities. They sent the envoys back with a message: "We are brothers in blood, but strangers in rule. We bow to no throne but our own." The Vaishanta had anticipated this. In fact, they had counted on it. The rejection allowed them to play the role of the aggrieved elder sibling. They spun the narrative to their own people. Mieritar was being rebellious. They were denying the sacred laws of ancestry. They required correction. And so, the legions marched. The outbreak of the First Crown War was a moment of profound psychological trauma for the Elven race. You must realize that prior to this, war was something waged against orcs, against dragons, against giants, entities that were other. To look across the battlefield and see a face that mirrored your own, to see eyes that held the same centuries of wisdom, to hear the enemy crying out to the same gods, Corellum, Sianin, Hanali, was deeply jarring. The initial invasion was a blitz of magical supremacy. The mages of Eravandar, the Selutar, unleashed spells of devastating power. They did not just throw fireballs. They manipulated the weather. They called down pillars of searing light that bypassed physical armor entirely. They sought to decapitate the leadership of Mieritar in a single stroke. But Mieritar was vast, and its people were resilient. The Green Elves and Dark Elves of the West did not fight in rigid formations like the Sun Elves. They fought like the forest itself. When the Golden Army marched into the woods fought back, roots twisted to trip horses. Heavy branches fell silently to crush scouts. Fog materialized from nowhere to separate battalions. The Dark Elves of Mieritar, who were particularly skilled in the arts of stealth and ambush, began to take a heavy toll on the invaders. The war settled into a grinding, bloody stalemate. For 200 years, the conflict raged. 2 centuries. Think of the generations of humans that would rise and fall in that time, while the elves fought the same bitter war, day after day, year after year. This period, from 12,000 to roughly 11,800, saw the slow strangulation of Mieritar. Aravandar realized they could not easily win a guerrilla war in the dense forests. So they changed tactics. They initiated a magical blockade. They set up wards along the borders that prevented teleportation and magical communication. They effectively cut Mieritar off from the rest of Faerûn. This is where the tragedy deepened. You might ask, where were the other elven nations? Why did Ilithia or Keltomia not intervene? The Vaishantar were masters of diplomacy as much as magic. They maintained a strict narrative control. To the elves of Keltomia and Chantal Othria, the ambassadors of Aravandar brought gifts and assurances. They described the conflict as a regrettable internal policing action. They showed the forged documents of lineage. They argued that if Keltomir intervened, they would be interfering in the domestic affairs of a sovereign family. Fear also played a role. The nations saw the destructive power Aravandar was unleashing. They saw the skies over Mieritar flashing with arcane storms. The leaders of Keltomir, prudent and cautious, decided that neutrality was the safest path. They did not want to draw the gaze of the Golden Giant. Left alone, isolated and outmatched in raw magical firepower, Mieritar began to crumble. The pivotal moment came not in a single battle, but in the exhaustion of resources. The constant magical bombardment eroded the defenses of the Mieritari cities. The high mages of Aravandar began to burn the forest that protected the defenders. Around 11,800, the resistance broke. The coronel of Mieritar was slain, in a last stand that legend says turned the rivers of the realm red for a 10-day. The Vaishanta forces swept in, occupying the major cities, dismantling the government, and installing puppet governors loyal to the Golden Throne. The annexation was total. The realm of Mieritar ceased to exist as an independent political entity. It became a province of the Aravandar Empire. But the victory was hollow. The occupation was brutal. The Sun Elves, convinced of their superiority, treated the Green and Dark Elves of the occupied territories as second-class citizens. They banned certain religious rites that they deemed primitive. They restricted the use of druidic magic, favoring the arcane. This sowed the seeds of a hatred that would not fade. The Dark Elves of Mieritar, in particular, chafed under this rule. Many of them fled south, seeking refuge in the open arms of Ilithia. They brought with them stories of the Golden Tyranny. They told of how the Sun Elves murdered their kin and stole their lands. These refugees became the kindling for the next great fire. In Ilithia, the ruling families listened to these tales with narrowing eyes. They saw the hypocrisy of Aravandar. They saw that the first people of the north were willing to break every taboo to gain power. The peace that followed the annexation of Miaritar lasted for only a brief flicker of time in the grand scheme of Elven history. Barely a century. It was a nervous, twitching peace. The Arivandar Empire now controlled a massive swath of northern Faerûn. They felt invincible. Their pride swelled to dangerous levels. They began to look at the maps again, their eyes drifting to the other disorderly nations. Meanwhile, in the south, Ilithia began to militarize. They were not going to wait to be annexed. If the Sun Elves wanted war, the Dark Elves would give them a war such as the world had never seen. They began to experiment with darker magics, seeking an edge that would counter the high magic of the north. The usurpation was complete. The brother had killed the brother and taken his inheritance. The Seldarine looked down, their hearts heavy, for they knew that the cycle of violence had only just begun. The First Crown War had shattered the trust of the Telquesia. The Second Crown War would shatter their sanity. As we prepare to move to the next section, reflect on the tragedy of Miaritar, a nation of art and nature, crushed simply because it stood in the way of an empire's vanity. The silence of the conquered forest is deafening. But in the south, the drums of war are beginning to beat a new rhythm, a rhythm of vengeance. The smoke from the burning forests of Miaritar has barely settled in our minds. Yet the wheel of history continues to turn. We must now shift our gaze away from the cool, pine-scented winds of the north and let our spirits drift southward. Feel the air grow warmer, heavier. Smell the scent of exotic spices, humid earth, and the metallic tang of ozone. We are traveling to the lands of the Shah and the dense, vine-choked jungles that border the southern seas. Here, the Second Crown War begins. While Arivandar was busy consolidating its hold over the conquered north, a different kind of darkness was brewing in the nation of Ilithia. As we discussed, the Dark Elves of this time were not yet the Drow. They lived under the sun and the stars. They had skin the color of polished obsidian and mahogany, and hair of silver and white. They were a people of immense passion, fierce pride, and a martial tradition that rivaled any in Faerûn. The Ilithiri leadership had watched the fall of Miaritar with calculated eyes. They saw the hypocrisy of the Sun Elves. They saw how Arivandar used the excuse of unification to enslave their neighbors. The ruling families of Ilithia, already prone to paranoia and aggressive expansionism, came to a singular, terrifying conclusion. If they did not strike first, they would be next. However, the Ilithiri logic was different from the Vaishantar. The Vaishantar sought to rule through law and high magic. The Ilithiri sought to rule through strength and terror. They believed that the only way to secure their safety was to create a ring of devastation around their borders that no northern army could cross. And so, in the year -11700, 3 centuries after the start of the First Crown War, the Second Crown War erupted. It is known to history as the Saber War. The name itself evokes the nature of the conflict. While the wars in the north were characterized by high magic, sieges, and political maneuvering, the wars in the south were characterized by the blade. The Saber Wars were fast, brutal, and bloody. They were wars of raiding, of skirmishes, of lightning-fast strikes in the night. The first victims of this new aggression were the moon and wood elf nations of Orissa, Siorpia, Thiranitar, and Illul. Picture these realms. They were nations of quiet beauty located in the deep woods that lay between Ilithia and the rest of the continent. The elves there were scholars, astronomers, and peacekeepers. They had maintained friendly, if distant, relations with Ilithia For centuries, trading star charts and rare woods, they believed their neighbors were fierce but honorable. They were unprepared for what came. Without a declaration of war, without an ultimatum, the Elithieri legions swarmed across the border. They did not come to occupy. They came to dismantle. The warriors of Elithia, wielding curved blades of glinting steel and clad in armor, made from the hides of jungle beasts, descended upon the settlements like a swarm of locusts. The fall of Orishar was swift and horrific. The Elithiri used fire as a primary weapon. They set the woods ablaze to drive the defenders out of their hidden glades. When the moon elves fled the flames, they ran straight into the waiting lines of Elithiri archers and swordsmen. It was a slaughter. The libraries of Orishar were torched. The observatories where they watched the dance of the heavens were pulled down, stone by stone. But Elithia was not satisfied. Their bloodlust was up, and their strategic plan required total dominance of the southern continent. They turned their gaze to Siopia, Faerûn, and Iyul. These nations, primarily of green elves, were similar in spirit to the people of Meerita. They were isolationists who wanted nothing to do with the politics of the greater world. The Ilithii did not care. To them, these nations were potential staging grounds for Aravandar. They were weak flanks. The invasion of these woodland realms was even more brutal. The Elithiori made pacts with the darker spirits of the jungle. They utilized their mastery of the terrain to outmaneuver the woodwise green elves. The battles here were fought in canopy, archers leaping from branch to branch, bodies falling like rain to the forest floor below. By the end of this campaign, Siopia, Faerûn, and Iyelur were wiped from the map. Their people were either killed, enslaved, or forced to flee north and west, joining a growing tide of refugees that was beginning to choke the roads of Faerûn. This period of history is difficult to recount because of its sheer ruthlessness. The Elithieri were operating under a philosophy of total war long before the term existed. They believed that by demonstrating such extreme violence, they would terrify the rest of the world into leaving them alone. They were successful in the terror, but they miscalculated the reaction. Instead of cowering, the destruction of these four nations galvanized the remaining Elven nations. The refugees flooding into Keltomir and Shantal Othria brought tales of the dark demons of the south. They spoke of elves who laughed as they burned villages, who took pleasure in the subjugation of their kin. This played perfectly into the hands of the Vaishantar Empire in the north. Remember, Aravanda had justified its war on Meerita by claiming cultural superiority. Now they could point to the south and say, "See, we told you. The Dark Elves are savages. They are a threat to all civilization. We must be strong to oppose them." The Elithieri aggression effectively validated the militarization of the north. But let us focus on the saber wars themselves for a moment longer. Why call them that? It refers to the specific fighting style that rose to prominence during these campaigns. The Elithieri sword dancers, warriors trained in a fluid, deadly dual-wielding style, became legendary. They eschewed heavy plate armor for mobility. They used magic to enhance their speed and strength, rather than to cast explosive spells. In the dense jungles and forests of the south, these tactics were devastating. The more traditional formations of the Moon and Green Elves could not cope with enemies who struck from the shadows, vanished, and struck again from a different angle. The psychological toll on the defenders was immense. The mere rumor of an Elithieri warband in the area was enough to cause settlements to empty. By the end of the main campaigns of the Second Crown War, the geopolitical map of Faerûn had been radically altered. The southern woodlands were largely under the control of Ilithia. The nations of Orishar, Siopia, Thiernitar, and Ilua were gone, their names whispered only in mourning songs. The survivors had fled to the nation of Keltomir, causing that realm to swell in population and paranoia. Keltomir, located along the coast of what is now Tethia and Ammon, found itself in an impossible position. To their north was the aggressive, expansionist empire of Arivandar. To their south was the savage, burning war machine of Ilithia. They were the meat between two grinding stones. The leaders of Keltomir, a coalition of moon and green elves, desperately tried to maintain neutrality. They fortified their borders. They built the great forest cities of the Tethir woods into fortresses. They refused to ally with either side, knowing that to choose a friend was to choose an enemy. But neutrality is a fragile shield when the world is on fire. The Saber Wars also marked a spiritual shift in the Elithieri people. In their quest for power and victory, they began to turn away from the lighter aspects of the Seldarine. Corellon Lorethian, the protector and creator, seemed too passive for their needs. They began to emphasize the worship of Faerûn, the god of thievery and territory, and other, darker entities. They reasoned that if the gods of light allowed their kin in the north to slaughter Miritar, then the gods of light were useless. They needed gods of war, gods of blood. This spiritual decay was subtle at first. It wasn't instant demon worship. It was a gradual hardening of the heart. It was the acceptance that the ends justify the means. It was the belief that survival required the abandonment of soft virtues, like mercy and compassion. As we stand at the end of the Second Crown War, roughly around the year minus 11,200, the world is locked in a tense standoff. The north is held by the Sun Elves, the south is held by the Dark Elves, and in the middle, the remnants of the Green and Moon Elves huddle in Shantal, Othria and Keltomir, watching the horizons with fear. The scale of the conflict is about to expand. The Elithieri, emboldened by their victories in the Saber Wars, are not content to sit in their southern jungles. They are looking north. They see Keltomir not as a neutral buffer, but as the next obstacle, and Arivandar, seeing the rise of a true rival, is preparing to march again. The skirmishes of the Saber Wars are over. The time of the Dragon Riders is approaching. The skies themselves will become a battlefield. Take a deep breath. Can you smell the smoke? It is the scent of a world tearing itself apart. The tragedy is compounding. What began as a dispute over lineage has mutated into a war for racial dominance, and the saddest part is that both sides, the gold and the dark, believe they are the heroes of their own stories. Let us prepare to witness the escalation. The chaos of the south has emboldened the north, and the stage is set for a collision that will shake the pillars of the earth. As the smoke from the Saber Wars drifted upward, choking the pristine skies of the southern coasts, the eyes of the Elven world turned toward the Middle Lands. The conflict, which had begun as a political dispute in the north and a brutal raiding campaign in the south, was about to undergo a terrifying metamorphosis. We are entering the era of the escalation, a time roughly 11,200 years before Dala Reckoning, where the very rules of warfare were rewritten in fire and blood. Our focus now settles upon the nation of Celtomir. To understand the tragedy that is about to unfold, you must first visualize the land as it was then. Celtomir was a sprawling, majestic realm that covered the regions we now know as Tethir, Amn, and Calimsham. It was a land of immense variety, from the mist-shrouded peaks of the Starspire Mountains to the deep, endless canopy of the Forest of Tethir, down to the glittering azure waters of the Sea of Swords. The Moon Elves and Green Elves, who called this place home, were masters of balance. They were traders, diplomats, and navigators, believing that wisdom lay in the middle path, far from the rigid dogmatism of Erevandar, or the savage aggression of Ilethia. But geography, which had once been their greatest asset, was now their curse. Celtomir was the buffer state. It was the shield of the north and the barrier to the south. And in the Crown Wars, a shield is meant to be battered. The escalation began not with a march of boots, but with the beating of leathery wings. The Ilithieri, emboldened by their annihilation of Orishar and Siopia, realized that to conquer the north, they needed to bypass the dense forests and fortified borders of Celtomir. They needed a weapon that could strike terror into the hearts of their enemies before a single arrow was loosed. They found this weapon in the volcanic peaks and jagged rifts of the southern mountain ranges. They found the dragons. This moment marks a fundamental shift in the history of Toril. Before this, dragons were solitary tyrants, apex predators who acknowledged no master. But the Ilithiri High Mages, using a combination of dark diplomacy, immense attributes of looted gold, and potent enchantment magic, achieved the impossible. They forged pacts with the chromatic flights. They bound red, green, and black dragons to their will, not as pets but as allies of war. Imagine the scene from the perspective of a Celtomir sentry stationed atop a high watchtower in the cloud peaks. The morning air is crisp and cold. The sun is just cresting the horizon, painting the sky in hues of soft pink and orange. And then, the light is blotted out. You look up, and your breath catches in your throat. The sky is filled with them. Great red dragons, their scales the color of fresh arterial blood, their wingspans wide enough to cast entire villages into shadow. Green dragons, winding through the air like serpentine nightmares, trailing vapors of chlorine gas. Black dragons, their skulls skeletal and terrifying, dripping acid that hisses as it hits the stone of your tower. And upon their backs, strapped into harnesses of iron and wyvern hide, ride the Ilithiri. This was the advent of the dragon riders. The Ilithiri warlords and mages rained death from the heavens. The tactical advantage was absolute. The defensive walls of Celtomir were built to stop armies on the ground. They were useless against an enemy that could fly over them and incinerate the city from above. The devastation inflicted upon Celtomir was apocalyptic. The red dragons unleashed cones of fire that turned the ancient, sacred groves of the Tethir forest into roaring infernos. Trees that had stood since the Age of Thunder were reduced to ash in seconds. The green dragons descended upon the troop concentrations, exhaling poisonous gas that melted the lungs of the defenders, leaving entire battalions dead, without a mark on them, save for the blisters on their skin. The psychological toll was perhaps even greater than the physical one. There is a primal fear in being hunted from the sky. The elves of Celtomir began to look up with dread. The shadow of a passing cloud was enough to send panic rippling through a settlement. The Elithiari riders used this fear, conducting terror raids deep behind the lines, burning granaries and libraries, ensuring that nowhere in Keltomere was safe. However, the Moon Elves of Keltomere were not a people to go quietly into the night. They were the children of the stars and the sea, and they possessed a resilience that the Elithiari had underestimated. They adapted. The High Mages of Keltomere began to weave mythal-like wards over their remaining major cities, domes of shimmering force that could withstand the breath of a dragon. They developed new spells, distinct from the Solars of the north or the necromancy of the south. They created lances of pure force that could pierce dragon scale at 1,000 paces. They trained griffin riders and giant eagle cavalries to meet the enemy in the air, swarming the great drakes like hornets, attacking a bear. Furthermore, Keltomere reached out to the metallic dragons, the gold and silver dragons of the Sword Coast, ancient and noble, had watched the Elithiari aggression with disgust. They saw the corruption of their chromatic cousins and the slaughter of the small folk, though dragons generally avoided the wars of humanoids. The scale of this conflict forced their hand. They allied with Keltomere. Visualize the skies over the forest of Tethia now. It is a chaotic swirl of color and magic. A massive gold dragon grapples with a red in mid-air, their claws locking, tumbling through the clouds, while elven mages on their backs hurl lightning and counterspells at one another. It is a war of mythic proportions, a clash of titans that shook the very foundations of the earth. The magical fallout from these battles was so intense that it scarred the weave itself, creating zones of wild magic where spells would fail or surge unpredictably, scars that would persist for millennia. But while Keltomere fought for its life against the dragons of the south, a colder, more insidious threat was closing in from the north. The Vaishantar Empire of Arivandar had been watching the destruction of Keltomere with calculating eyes. To the coronal of Arivandar, the dragon raids were not a tragedy. They were an opportunity. The Vaishantar philosophy was one of unification and control. They viewed Keltomere's independence as an obstinate refusal to accept the inevitable leadership of the Sun Elves. As Keltomere bled, Arivandar made its move. It was not an invasion, at least not in name. It was a diplomatic stranglehold. Emissaries from Arivandar arrived at the beleaguered court of Keltomere. They came bearing gifts of food and magical supplies. They spoke with honeyed voices, expressing deep sorrow for the suffering of their cousins in the south. They offered the protection of the Golden Army. They proposed that Arivandar move its legions into Keltomere to secure the northern border and assist in the defense against the dark savages. But the leaders of Keltomere, battle-weary as they were, saw the trap. They knew the history of Mieratar. They knew that if they allowed the Vaishantar legions to garrison their cities, those legions would never leave. The offer of protection was a thinly veiled demand for annexation. Arivandar was effectively saying, "Submit to us, and we will save you from the dragons. Refuse us, and you face them alone." It was an impossible choice. Submit and lose your soul, or resist and lose your life. With a courage that history has often overlooked, the Council of Keltomere refused. They thanked Arivandar for the offer but stated that Keltomere would stand on its own 2 feet. They would not trade one tyrant for another. The reaction from Arivandar was cold fury. The refusal was seen as an insult to the Golden Throne. The Vaishantar could not allow a lesser nation to defy them, especially one so weakened, and so the escalation took on a double meaning. Celtomere was now fighting a hot war on its southern border against Ilithia, and a cold war on its northern border against Eravandal. The Vaishantar began to press the border. They moved troops into disputed territories, claiming they were stabilizing the region. They cut off trade routes. They spread propaganda within Celtomere, trying to incite a coup against the Celtomere leadership, arguing that the council was suicidal for refusing Aravandal's help. Under this immense pressure, dragonfire from the south, political suffocation from the north, the social fabric of Celtomere began to tear. The unity of the nation fractured. Great clans and noble houses, feeling that the central government could no longer protect them, began to secede. They took their households and retreated deep into the wildest, most defensible parts of the highlands and the deep forest. Celtomere ceased to function as a unified empire and dissolved into a collection of warring city-states and fortified enclaves. The nation was effectively broken, not by a single fatal blow, but by the grinding pressure of being the meat between two stones. The tragedy of Celtomere is the tragedy of the bystander, caught in the crossfire. They were a people who sought only to live in their woods and sail their seas. But the ambitions of the sun, elves, and the hatred of the dark elves allowed them no peace. As the era of the escalation drew to a close, the geography of the Sword Coast had been permanently altered. The great forests were scorched and broken. The bones of dragons and elves lay intermingled in the ruins of once beautiful cities. The Ilithiari had proven that their malice knew no bounds, and the Vaishantar had proven that their benevolence was a lie. But the Vaishantar were not done. With Celtomere neutralized and fragmented, the Golden Empire needed a new target. They needed to secure their eastern flank before they could turn their full might against the south. Their eyes drifted away from the smoking coast and settled on the quiet interior lands. They looked toward Chantal-Othria. The peace-loving green elves of Chantal-Othria had watched the wars from a distance, praying that their isolation would protect them. They believed that if they stayed quiet, the giants would pass them by. They were wrong. In the eyes of the Vaishantar, neutrality was just another form of rebellion waiting to happen. The dragon riders had set the sky on fire, but the next chapter of the Crown Wars would be fought in the mud and the trenches. It would be a siege of heartbreaking duration, a grinding attrition that would test the very limits of elven endurance. The stage is set for the Third Crown War. The armies are pivoting. The shadows are lengthening over the central forests, and the Seldarine, watching their children tear the world apart, are weeping silent tears that fall as rain upon the bloody earth. Let us move forward to witness the siege of Chantal-Ar. Turn your mind's eye away from the smoking, dragon-scorched coastline of Celtomere. Let the sounds of the crashing waves and the roaring drakes fade into the distance. We are traveling inland now, moving east across the heart of Faerûn. The air here is different. It is still, heavy with the scent of pine needles, damp earth, and the sweet, cloying perfume of wildflowers. We are entering the vast emerald canopy of Chantal-Othria. To understand the tragedy of the Third Crown War, you must first fall in love with what was lost. Chantal-Othria was not a nation of towering stone spires or grand magical academies. It was a realm of quiet harmony. The green elves who lived here did not seek to dominate the land. They sought to be part of it. Their settlements were woven into the living wood of the trees, connected by bridges of vine and woven spider silk. They were a people of deep spiritualism, devoted to the Eldarine in their most natural aspects. They valued isolation, peace, and the simple rhythms of the forest season. For centuries, they had watched the madness unfolding in the west and north, with a mixture of pity and terror. They believed that their neutrality was their armor. They believed that if they offered no threat, they would receive no violence. They were wrong. In the year -10,900 Doctor, the Vaishantar Empire turned its golden gaze upon them. The justification for the war was, as always with the Vaishantar, a masterpiece of diplomatic fiction. The Coronel of Aravanda claimed that Chantal Othraya was engaging in dangerous passivity. They argued that by refusing to join the Grand Alliance of the North against the Dark Elves of Ilithia, Chantal Othraya was effectively aiding the enemy. The Vaishantar propagandists spun tales that Ilithiri spies were using the neutral forests of Chantal Othraya as a highway to infiltrate the north. They claimed that the Green Elves were hoarding resources, magical herbs, rare woods and crystals that were essential for the war effort. It was a lie, of course. The truth was far simpler and far uglier. Aravanda desired a contiguous empire. Chantal Othraya sat in the middle of the continent, a large, independent wedge between the Vaishantar holdings in the north and the lands they wished to control in the south. To the imperial mapmakers in Aravanda, Chantal Othraya was messy. It was an irregularity that needed to be smoothed out. The invasion did not begin with a declaration of war. It began with the sudden appearance of Vaishantar peacekeeping forces on the northern borders of Chantal Othraya. These legions, resplendent in their gilded armor, demanded the right of passage to move troops south to fight Ilithia. The Coronel of Chantal Othraya, Inloeth, a wise and gentle ruler, saw through the ruse immediately. He knew that an army that marches into your land rarely marches out again. He refused the request, citing the ancient laws of sovereignty. That refusal was the signal the Vaishantar generals had been waiting for. The Third Crown War, often called the Siege of Chantal Othraya, was not a war of lightning strikes like the Sabre Wars. It was a war of strangulation. It was a slow, grinding, methodical destruction of a nation that refused to break. Imagine the contrast on the battlefield. On one side, you have the golden army of Aravanda, disciplined, regimented, utilizing high magic to create shield walls and artillery barrages of arcane fire. On the other side, you have the rangers and druids of Chantal Othraya, clad in leathers and leaves, wielding longbows of yew, calling upon the roots of the earth and the beasts of the forest to fight for them. The Vaishantar did not just fight the elves, they fought the forest itself. Their high mages developed spells specifically designed to clear terrain. They unleashed blights, magical contagions that caused the underbrush to wither and turn to dust. Removing the cover that the green elves relied upon, they burned vast swathes of the woods, not out of anger, but out of cold, tactical necessity. They were turning the battlefield into a grid, erasing the chaotic advantage of nature. For the defenders, life became a nightmare of constant vigilance. The green elves were masters of ambush, but they were vastly outnumbered. They could not meet the Vaishantar in open field battles. They had to bleed them, arrow by arrow, trap by trap. The war dragged on for nearly 3 centuries. Think of that, 300 years of fighting. Children were born in the siege, grew up learning to string a bow before they could read, fought in the wars, and died of old age or a sword thrust, never knowing a day of peace. The isolation of Chantal Othraia was total. Arivandar used its naval superiority and its control of the northern trade routes to cut off all supplies. No food came in, no weapons came in, no help came in. Keltomir was too broken to assist. Ilithia was too busy, laughing at the north tearing itself apart to intervene. Chantal Othraia was alone in the dark. The turning point of the war came with the death of Coronel Inloath. He had led his people for millennia. He was the spiritual anchor of the nation. In the darkest days of the siege, when the food stores were empty and the Vaishantar were burning the outer circles of the capital, he remained a beacon of hope. He led from the front, his druidic magic turning the very soil into a weapon against the invaders. But the Vaishantar knew that to kill the nation, they had to kill the head. They orchestrated a trap, using a double agent, a traitor seduced by promises of power in the new regime. They lured Inloath into a parley. They promised a ceasefire. They promised that they were willing to negotiate a withdrawal. It was an assassination. When Inloath arrived at the meeting place, a sacred grove in the heart of the forest, the Vaishantar mages dropped the facade. They unleashed a focused bombardment of disintegration spells. The coronel and his honor guard were obliterated in an instant. With the death of Inloath, the spirit of the resistance broke. The central command structure of Chantal Othraia collapsed. The despair was palpable. The green elves looked at the ashes of their leader, looked at the endless golden ranks of their enemy, and realized that their gods were silent. Around the year -10,600 Doctor, the conquest was complete. Arivandar did not burn Chantal Othraia to the ground, as Ilithia had done to Orisar. That would have been a waste of resources. Instead, they annexed it. They installed a puppet government. They placed Vaishantar nobles in charge of the great forest cities. They rewrote the laws. The occupation was insidious. It wasn't a slaughter. It was a suffocation. The culture of Chantal Othraia was systematically dismantled. The worship of the Seldarine was regulated by state-sanctioned priests who preached the supremacy of the Sun Elves. The druidic circles were disbanded, labeled as insurgent cells. The native language of the Green Elves was banned in official courts. Arivandar had won. They now controlled a massive contiguous empire, stretching from the high forest in the north, down through the fallen lands of Mierital, and now encompassing the central heartlands of Chantal Othraia. They were the masters of the north. But victory breeds arrogance, and arrogance breeds blindness. The Vaishantar believed they were untouchable. They believed that because they had silenced the green elves of the center, they had stabilized their empire. But they had not calculated the cost of their cruelty. They did not see the resentment boiling just beneath the surface. More importantly, they did not see the shadow lengthening in the west. While the Vaishantar were busy subduing Chantal Othraia, the occupied land of Mieritar, the first victim of the Crown Wars, was stirring. The green and dark elves of Mieritar, who had lived under the Vaishantar boot for over 1,000 years, were reaching their breaking point. Resistance movements were forming in the deep woods. High mages of Mieritar, who had hidden their talents for centuries, were beginning to gather in secret conclaves. The Vaishantar, drunk on their victory in the Third Crown War, decided that they needed to make a final example. They needed to ensure that no subject nation would ever dare to rise against them again. They looked at the unrest in Miaritar, and they decided that occupation was not enough. They needed a solution that was permanent. They began to prepare a ritual of such dark and terrible magnitude that it would stain the history of magic forever. The Third Crown War was the end of innocence for the Central Lands. But what comes next is the end of the land itself. We are approaching the darkest hour of the Crown Wars. We are approaching the event that horrified the gods and broke the world. Prepare yourself. The air is growing cold. The sky is turning the color of a bruised plum. The high mages of Aravandar are chanting, and the killing storm is about to break. We must now turn our eyes back to Miaritar to witness the dark disaster. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the lore of the Crown Wars, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It helps us continue to archive these lost histories. The silence that falls over history now is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of a held breath, the terrified pause of a world that knows a blow is coming, but does not know where it will land. We have witnessed the slow strangulation of Miaritar in the First War. We have seen the bloody skirmishes of the Saber Wars. We have watched the skies burn with dragonfire in the escalation, and we have seen the methodical dismantling of Chantal-Othfrire. But all of these horrors, terrible as they were, still adhered to the grim logic of conventional warfare. Armies marched, swords clashed, territories changed hands. What happens next, in the year -10,500 Doctor, abandons logic entirely. It abandons morality. It is the moment where the Vaishantar Empire, in its pursuit of total order, embraces total chaos. Let us return to the occupied lands of Miaritar. For 1500 years, this nation had been a vassal of Aravandar. Its people, the Green and Dark Elves, had lived under the heel of the Sun Elf governors. They had seen their cultures suppressed, their resources stripped, and their dignity eroded. Yet, the spirit of Miaritar had not broken. Deep within the high forest, in the hidden glens and the secret cavern networks, a resistance had been festering. To the Vaishantar High Command, sitting in their crystalline towers in the north, this resistance was an intolerable itch. They viewed Miaritar not as a tragic victim, but as an unruly child that refused to learn its lesson. The coronel of Aravandar, Gilvastuta, a man whose heart was as cold and hard as diamond, decided that the time for policing actions was over. He looked at the map of his empire, saw the sprawling green expanse of Miaritar, and decided that the problem was the land itself. The forest offered too many hiding places. The connection the Miaritari elves had to their druidic roots was too strong. To break the people, he reasoned, one must break the land. He convened the Selutar, the high mages of Aravandar. These were the most powerful arcane practitioners on the face of Toril. They were masters of Arsalutel quests, the great art of high magic. This magic was capable of lifting cities into the sky, of extending life indefinitely, of reshaping reality. It was a gift from Corel and Lorethian, meant to be used for creation and defense. But the Vaishantar perverted it. They began a ritual that would last for months. Imagine the scene in the northern capital, in a great amphitheater open to the stars, hundreds of high mages gathered, chanting in unison, their voices weaving a spell of such complexity that the very air around them began to shimmer and warp. They drew upon the energies of the sun, but they twisted them, filtering the light until it became a searing, oppressive force. Down in Mirita, the air began to change. The birds stopped singing, the wind died, a strange metallic taste filled the mouths of the elves. The sky took on a sickly, bruised hue, a color between purple and necrotic green. The sun became a pale, distant disk, obscured by a gathering haze that felt heavy on the skin. The druids of Mieritar felt it first. They screamed. They felt the ley lines of the earth crying out in agony. They tried to warn their people, to tell them to flee, but there was nowhere to run. The borders were sealed by the Vaishantar armies, who had withdrawn to safe distances, waiting. Then, the storm broke. History calls it the Dark Disaster, or the Killing Storm. It was not a storm of rain and thunder. It was a storm of raw, corrupted magical energy. Clouds the color of dried blood rolled over the horizon, moving with unnatural speed. They boiled and churned, descending from the upper atmosphere until they swallowed the treetops. And then the rain began. It was a thick, oily black sludge that hissed as it touched the earth. Where it landed on leaves, the leaves withered and turned to grey ash. Where it landed on stone, the stone cracked and dissolved. Where it landed on flesh, there was only silence, for the end came too quickly for screams. The killing storm raged for 3 months, 90 days of darkness. The chemical and magical composition of the storm was designed to rot organic matter at an accelerated rate. The great ancient oaks of Mieritar, trees that were thousands of years old, dissolved into muck. The intricate wooden cities, sung from the trees by generations of woodshapers, melted away like wax held to a flame. Inside the storm, the horror was absolute. The elves of Mieritar, tens of thousands of them, none, were trapped in a dissolving world. The magic of the storm dampened their own spells. They could not teleport out. They could not shield themselves. Families huddled together in the deepest root cellars, listening to the sound of the world above them, liquefying, until the black sludge seeped through the cracks in the ceiling. It was a genocide. There is no other word for it. It was the systematic extermination of a people and their ecosystem. When the storm finally lifted, the sun looked down upon a landscape that was unrecognizable. The lush, vibrant high forest of Mieritar was gone. In its place stretched a vast, desolate wasteland of mud, acidic pools, and rotting vegetation. The rich soil had been scoured away, leaving behind a bleak, barren plateau. This wasteland exists to this day. You know it as the High Moor. Walk with me in your mind across this new terrible landscape in the year -10,500. The air reeks of sulfur and decay. The ground is soft and treacherous, swallowing the boots of anyone foolish enough to tread there. There are no birds, there are no deer. There is only the silence of the grave. The magnitude of the dark disaster sent shock waves through the magical weave of Toril. The Seldarine, watching from Arvandor, were paralyzed with horror. Corellon the Wrathian had given his children free will, and with that free will, they had created a hell on earth. The sheer scale of the atrocity created a spiritual wound in the elven consciousness that has never fully healed. For the Vaishantar Empire, the operation was a success. The Mieritar problem had been solved. The resistance was dead. The land was ruined. Yes, but it was no longer a threat. They spun the narrative that the disaster was a result of Mieritari wild magic gone wrong. a cautionary tale of what happens when lesser races try to wield power they do not understand. But the rest of the world knew the truth. In the south, the dark elves of Ilithia watched the clouds clear over the high moor. They saw the destruction, and for the first time in the Crown Wars, the Ilithiari felt true fear. They realized that their enemy, the Sun Elves of Arivandar, were not just arrogant, they were monsters. They were willing to destroy the world to rule it. The Ilithiari leadership looked at their own defenses, their swords, their drakes, their minor necromancy, and realized it was not enough. If Arivandar decided to unleash a dark disaster on Ilithia, the jungles of the south would become just another bog. This realization broke something in the Ilithiari soul. Until this moment, their corruption had been gradual, a slide into ruthlessness and warlordism. But the dark disaster proved that the gods of light, Corellon and the Seldarine, would not protect them. Corellon had let Mirita burn. He had stood by while his favored Sun Elves committed mass murder. The Ilithiari decided that if the gods of light were indifferent, they would turn to the gods who were listening. They would turn to the gods of hate. The dark disaster is the pivot point of the entire Crown Wars saga. It is the moment the moral event horizon was crossed. It justified, in the twisted logic of the desperate, any action taken in retaliation. Imagine the survivors of Mierita, the few ragged bands who had been on the borders, or deep in the underdark tunnels when the storm hit. They emerged to find their world gone. These survivors, traumatized and filled with a cold black hatred, made their way south. They joined the Ilithiari. They brought with them the first-hand accounts of the melting flesh and the black rain. Their stories were the fuel that Ilithia needed. The fear turned to rage. The rage turned to fanaticism. The catastrophe of the High Moor also affected the other races of Faerûn. The humans, still in their primitive tribes, watched the destruction of the fair folk with awe and terror. They learned to fear magic. They learned that the elves were not just beautiful guardians of the world, but potential destroyers of it. The dwarves, deep in their mountains, felt the tremors of the earth dying and barred their gates, resolving to have nothing to do with the surface wars. The dark disaster was a suicide note for the Elven Golden Age. Even though the Empire of Arivandar still stood, even though its towers still gleamed, its soul was rotted. You cannot murder a nation and remain whole. The high mages who cast the spell found themselves haunted. Some went mad. Some simply wasted away, their life force drained by the sheer malice of the magic they had wielded. But the immediate consequence was the reaction of Ilithia. They needed a weapon that could counter the high magic of the north, a weapon that didn't just kill the body but destroyed the soul. They began to look into the oldest, darkest texts. They began to whisper the names of forbidden entities, Gonadar, the Elder Eye, and another, a beautiful, terrible goddess who had been cast out of the Seldarine long ago, waiting in the demon web pits for her moment to return. The Fourth Crown War is looming. It will not be a war of territory. It will be a war of corruption. The Ilithiari are about to make a pact that will damn them for eternity, transforming them from the dark-skinned elves of the sun into the Drow of the Underdark. But before that transformation takes hold, they will strike back. They will unleash the fury of the abyss upon the north. As you let the image of the desolate High Moor settle in your mind, a scar on the face of Faerûn that remains to this day, Understand that this was the price of pride. The Vaishantar wanted unity, and they created a graveyard. And from that graveyard, something terrible is about to rise. Leave the grey, suffocating ash of the high moor behind. Let the cold wind of that desolate plateau fade from your memory. We must travel south again, but the warmth we find there is no longer the comforting heat of the sun on the jungle canopy. It is a feverish, sweating heat. It is the humidity of a storm that never breaks. We return to Ilithia, the nation of the Dark Elves, in the immediate aftermath of the Dark Disaster. To understand the Fourth Crown War, you must step into the psyche of the Ilithiari leadership. Imagine standing in the great stone council chambers of their capital, Atornesh. The news has just arrived. The scouts have returned from the north, their eyes wide with a horror that transcends language. They tell of the killing storm. They tell of the high forest of Mierita being reduced to toxic sludge. They tell of the silence where millions of voices once sang. The reaction in Ilithia was not sorrow. It was a terrified realization that shattered their worldview. For centuries, the Crown Wars had been a conflict of territory and ideology. But the Vaishantar Empire had changed the rules. By unleashing the Dark Disaster, the Sun Elves had proven that they were willing to commit genocide to achieve their vision of unity. The Ilithiari High Lords looked at each other and saw their own future. They knew that the Vaishantar regarded them with even more contempt than they had the Green Elves of Mierita. If Arivanda could melt a forest to kill a rebellion, what would they do to the savage Dark Elves? They would burn the South to bedrock. Fear is a powerful motivator, but desperation is a dangerous alchemist. It transforms morals into obstacles. The Ilithiari realized they could not win a conventional magical war. The High Mages of Arivanda held the power of the sun. They held the legacy of the Seldarene's highest blessings. The Ilithiari mages were powerful, yes, but they could not match the sheer destructive scale of the Vaishantar circles. They needed an equalizer. They needed a source of power that was not bound by the rules of the Seldarene. And so, the turning began. It started slowly, in the shadows of the temples. The worship of the traditional gods, Corellon, Angharad, Rilifane, began to wane. Why worship a father who allows one brother to murder the other with impunity? If Corellon would not save Mierita, he would not save Ilithia. The Ilithiari turned first to Faerûn, the masked lord, the god of thievery and shadows. He was the son of Corellon, but he was a rebel. He promised them survival through stealth and supremacy. But Faerûn's power was subtle, and the Ilithiari needed something blunt. They needed a hammer to break the Vaishantar shield. They dug deeper. They began to listen to the whispers that drifted up from the cracks in the earth. They found Gaunadal, that which lurks, an ancient eldritch entity, older perhaps than the Seldarene itself, the god of oozes, slimes, and outcasts. The worship of Gaunadal was forbidden, reviled as madness. But in the year minus 10,450 Daga, madness seemed like the only rational response to the world. Secret cults formed within the Ilithiari military. They performed rites in deep caverns beneath the jungle floor. They sacrificed sentient beings, captured enemies, slaves, even their own kin, to the Elder Eye. In exchange, Gaunadal granted them terrible gifts. He gave them acids that could melt Vaishantar gold. He gave them control over gelatinous horrors that could be unleashed on the battlefield. But even Ganadao was not enough. His power was mindless, chaotic. The Elithiri needed allies with intelligence. They needed generals. This leads us to the single most damning act in the history of the Telquasia: the summoning of the Tanari. The Abyss is a plane of infinite chaos and evil. It is inhabited by demons, creatures of destruction who despise all life. For eons, Elven magic had been used to keep these entities out of Toril. The boundaries between the planes were carefully guarded. The Elithiri High Mages, led by the fanatical clan leaders who saw annihilation heading their way, decided to open the door. Using knowledge stolen from forbidden scrolls and fueled by the blood of mass sacrifices, the Elithiri tore a rift in the weave. They did not just summon mindless beasts, they summoned the Lords of the Abyss. The most infamous of these was a Bala named Wendenai. Visualize this entity, a creature of fire and shadow, standing twice the height of an elf, with wings of wreath flame and a sword of lightning. Wendenai was a seducer, a corrupter of bloodlines. He did not just want to kill, he wanted to tame. The pact was struck. The Elithiri pledged their service, and in some cases, their very souls, in exchange for the power to destroy Arivandel. Wendenai and other demons like him were brought into the material plane. They were given command of Elithiri legions. This marked the beginning of the Fourth Crown War. The nature of the conflict changed instantly. When the Elithiri armies marched north again, they were no longer just elves in armor. They were a host of nightmares. Imagine the Vaishanta garrisons stationed on the southern borders of the occupied lands. They were expecting a raid of dark elf rangers. Instead, they saw the sky turn red. They smelled the stench of ozone and brimstone. And then, the demons came. Bellas strode across the battlefield, their whips decapitating sun. Elf champions with ease, Vrox, vulture-like demons, swooped down from the clouds, screeching stunning songs that paralyzed entire battalions. Hezru, toad-like horror, waded into the rivers, poisoning the water supplies. Behind them marched the Elithiri, but they were changing. The corruption of the Abyss is not just spiritual, it is physical. Exposure to such concentrated demonic energy began to warp them. Their eyes, once the color of amber or violet, began to glow with a crimson, predatory light. Their skin took on a polished obsidian sheen, harder than before. They gained resistance to the magic of the Sun Elves. The counterattack was devastating. The Elithiri drove the Vaishanta forces back out of the southern lands. They retook the ruins of Keltomir. They pushed into Chantal Othria. But this was not a liberation. When the Elithiri freed a city from Vaishantar control, they did not restore its freedom, they sacked it. They offered the population to their new demonic masters, the Green Elves of Chantal Othria, who had already suffered under the Vaishanta boot, now found themselves facing the Elithiri blade. The brutality of the Fourth Crown War exceeded even the Dark Disaster in its intimacy. The Dark Disaster was a cold, distant spell. The Fourth Crown War was up close. It was visceral. The Elithiri, emboldened by the demons, reveled in cruelty. They didn't just want to win, they wanted to inflict pain. They wanted to make the Sun Elves suffer as Mirita had suffered. This is the tragedy of the cycle of abuse. The victim becomes the abuser. The Elithiri, traumatized by the genocide of their cousins, became agents of genocide themselves. The psychological impact on the Vaishantar Empire was profound. For the first time, the master race was terrified. Their high magic, designed to manipulate the natural order, struggled against the chaotic, illogical nature of the abyss. A fireball spell might simply vanish when cast at a Bala, or turn into a flock of bats. The predictability of magic was breaking down. However, the greatest cost was paid by the Elithiuri themselves. The demon Wendonai was cunning. He knew that to truly own the Dark Elves, he had to bind them by blood. He encouraged, and in some cases enforced, the intermingling of demonic essence with the Elven bloodlines. The ruling families of Elithiur began to claim descent from these dark pacts. They believed it made them stronger, godlike. In reality, it was a spiritual poison. It amplified their paranoia. It stripped away their capacity for empathy. It cemented the matriarchal, cutthroat hierarchy that would later define Drow society. The concept of love was replaced by possession. The concept of loyalty was replaced by fear. By the year -10,200 Doctor, the war had consumed nearly all of Western Faerûn. The Vaishantar were fighting a defensive war on multiple fronts, their empire crumbling at the edges. The Elithiuri were pushing north, a tide of darkness that seemed unstoppable. But the Seldarine were watching. Up until this point, the gods had hesitated to intervene directly. They respected the free will of their children, even when that will was turned to evil. But the summoning of the abyss was a line that could not be uncrossed. The corruption of the Elithiuri was threatening the fundamental balance of the world. If the demons were allowed to establish a permanent foothold on Toril through the Elithiuri Empire, the entire planet could be dragged into the lower planes. Corellon Larethian, the creator, felt every death, but he also felt the corruption of his own essence within the Dark Elves. He saw the entity that was guiding them, not just Gornador, and not just the demons. He saw the hand of an old enemy, a traitor within his own house. As the Fourth Crown War rages, with demons walking the surface of Faerûn and the sky choked with the smoke of burning cities, we must shift our gaze from the battlefield to the divine realm. The corruption of the Elithiuri was not merely a political choice. It was the result of a celestial conspiracy. To understand why the Dark Elves fell so far, so fast, we must look at the Spider Queen. We must look at Aroshni. The mortal war is about to trigger a divine war. The web has been spun, and the Elithiuri are the flies caught in the center. As we prepare for the next chapter, feel the weight of this corruption. It is heavy, sticky, like the webs of a spider. The Elithiuri have won their battles, but they have lost their souls. They think they are the masters of the demons, but they are the slaves. The turning point of the Seldarine is approaching. The judgment is coming. Let us step away from the mud and the screaming of the material plane. Leave the smoking ruins of Chantal Othria and the corrupted jungles of Elithia behind. We must ascend. Let your mind drift upward, past the clouds of Faerûn, past the stars of the night sky, traversing the astral sea until we reach the plain of Arborea, and specifically the realm of Arvandor. It is jarring, is it not, to move from the horror of the Crown Wars to a place of such blinding, perfect beauty. Arvandor is the home of the Seldarine, the Elven pantheon. Here, the forests are eternal, the rivers flow with wine and nectar, and the light is a living thing that sings of creation. It is a paradise, But as we have learned from the history of the Elves, even paradise can hide a serpent. While the Vaishantar and Ilithiri were tearing the mortal world apart, a mirrored conflict was unfolding in the heavens. This is not a coincidence. In the Forgotten Realms, the divine and the mortal are inextricably linked. The faith of the mortal fuels the god, and the will of the god directs the mortal. The corruption of the Ilithiri was not just a result of desperation. It was the result of a divine seduction. At the center of this celestial tragedy stands a figure of breathtaking beauty and terrifying ambition, Roshni. Before she was Lolth, the Spider Queen, she was Roshni, the Weaver of Destiny. She was the consort of Corellon Lorethian, the king of the Seldarine. She was the mother of his children, Elistre and Faerûn. Her skin was the color of polished midnight. Her eyes burned with the light of stars, and she was the patron of artisans and destiny. She was beloved. But Roshni was not content. She looked at Corellon, who represented the chaotic, free-spirited nature of the Elves, and she felt contempt. She believed that the Elves, the Telquesir, were destined to rule all existence, not just live in harmony with it. She saw the chaos of the Crown Wars, not as a tragedy, but as proof that Corellon's philosophy of freedom was a failure. She believed that only through domination, rigid, ruthless control, could the Elves achieve their true potential. And perhaps most human of all her failings, she was jealous. She desired the power of the Corellon for herself. She did not want to be the consort. She wanted to be the absolute ruler of the Seldarine. To achieve this coup, Roshni began to weave a web of treachery that spanned planes. She needed allies who shared her hunger or her hatred. She found her first conspirator in her own son, Faerûn. The Lord of Shadows was ambitious, chafing under his father's rule, and he readily agreed to aid his mother in exchange for dominion over the Elven people. But she needed more brute force. She reached out to the enemies of the Elves. She made pacts with Gonador, the Elder Eye, playing on his desire to consume the world. She whispered to Mlar, the Beast Lord, promising him the blood of the Seldarine. She even courted the Orc god, Grumsh, the archenemy of Corellon, feeding him intelligence on Corellon's movements. While the Ilithiri on Toril was summoning demons, Roshni was positioning her pieces in Arvandor, Undergi. The betrayal unfolded in stages. The first attempt on Corellon's life was subtle. A mechanic of war, Corellon possessed a legendary magical scabbard for his sword, Sahandrian. This scabbard protected him from wounds, making him effectively invincible in battle. Roshni, under the guise of a loving partner polishing his gear, stole the true scabbard and replaced it with a forgery, a useless replica that looked identical but held no magic. She then orchestrated an ambush. During a grand hunt in the forests of Arvandor, she arranged for Mala and a host of bestial spirits to attack the Seldarine. In the chaos, Corellon drew his sword. Expecting the protection of his scabbard, he waded into the fight with his usual reckless bravery. But when the claws of the Beast Lord raked him, the skin broke, the blood flowed, Corellon was stunned. He was vulnerable. He fought with the fury of a cornered lion, but he was overwhelmed. It was only the intervention of the other Seldarin, specifically Seheni Moonbo and Hanali Selenil, that saved him. They drove the beasts back, but Corellon was grievously wounded. He did not suspect his wife. He believed the scabbard had simply failed, or that the magic of his enemies was stronger than anticipated. Aroshni played the part of the grieving, terrified nursemaid perfectly. She tended to his wounds, all the while pouring subtle poisons into his ears, whispering that the other gods were weak, that he needed to be stronger, harder. But her failure to kill him only made her more desperate. The war on Toril was escalating. The Elithiri were now fully under the sway of the demonic forces she was secretly funneling to them. She needed to finish the job in Arvandor to consolidate her power. Her second attempt was far more brazen. It involved the corruption of her daughter, Eilistrae. Eilistrae, the Dark Maiden, was the antithesis of her brother Faerûn. She was a goddess of song, swordplay, and moonlight, devoted to her father and the joy of the Elven people. Aroshni knew she could not turn Eilistrae to evil, so she decided to use her as a weapon of tragedy. Aroshni orchestrated a massive invasion of Arvandor. She opened the gates of the plain to an alliance of anti-Seldarine deities, including the relentless armies of the Orc pantheon led by Groom One-Eye. The Battle of Arvandor was a cataclysm that shook the heavens. Divine blood was spilled upon the golden grass. In the heat of the battle, Corellon was engaged in single combat with Groomsh. The two titans clashed, their blows shattering mountains in the distance. Aroshni stood nearby, feigning support. She saw an opening. An ogre mage, one of the invading horde, was sneaking up on Corellon's flank. She called out to Eilistrae, handing her a bow and a quiver of enchanted arrows. "Save your father," she cried. "Strike the beast." Eilistrae, acting on pure instinct and love, drew the bow. She aimed at the ogre mage threatening Corellon and loosed the arrow. Her aim was true. But Aroshni, the weaver of destiny, tugged at the threads of magic. With a subtle gesture, she walked the flight path of the arrow. The missile curved in the air, bypassing the ogre mage entirely, and plunged deep into Corellon's chest. The battlefield went silent. Corellon fell, pierced by the arrow of his own daughter. Groomsh roared in triumph, raising his spear to deliver the killing blow. It was the most perilous moment in the history of the multiverse. If Corellon died, the Seldarine would shatter, and the Elves would fall into eternal darkness. But Seheni Moonbow, the goddess of moonlight and mysteries, had been watching. Sehinin is the subtle power of the Seldarine. She sees what is hidden in the shadows. She had suspected Aroshni since the incident with the scabbard. She saw the magical manipulation of the arrow. Sehanina intervened, not with a sword, but with the power of the moon. She blinded Groomsh with a flare of pure silver light, allowing the other gods to drag Corellon's unconscious body to safety. She then turned her gaze upon Aroshni. The battle for Arvandor raged on, but the internal coup had failed. The invading armies were eventually driven back, largely due to the martial prowess of Torm and the other allied gods who came to the Seldarine's aid. But the aftermath was a courtroom of sorrow. Corellon survived. As he lay recovering, the truth was laid bare. Sehinin Moonbow wove an illusion that replayed the events: the theft of the scabbard, the secret meetings with Faerûn and the enemies of the Elves, and finally, the magical diversion of Eilistrae's arrow. The revelation broke Corellon's heart. The physical wound from the arrow healed, but the betrayal by his consort left a scar on his soul that would never fade. He looked at Aroshni, who stood before the gathered Seldarine, not in repentance, but in defiance. Aroshni laughed. She realized the game was up, and she dropped the mask. She spat on Corellan's mercy. She declared that he was weak, a fool who allowed his children to be slaughtered while he danced in the moonlight. She proclaimed that the destiny of the elves was conquest, and that she would be the one to lead them to it. Then she tried to escape. She transformed into a colossal spider, a monstrosity of chitin and venom, attempting to attack Corellan one last time. Corellan, heavy with grief but firm in justice, pronounced judgment. He did not kill her. Death was too light a punishment for a god. Instead, he banished her. He stripped her of her divinity as a member of the Seldarine. He cursed her form, locking her into the shape of the spider demon she had chosen. He cast her out of Arvandor. She fell. She fell through the plains, screaming her hatred, until she crashed into the 66th layer of the abyss. There in the darkness she bound the webs of the plane to herself. She became Lore, the demon queen of spiders. But the judgment did not end there. Faerûn, for his part in the conspiracy, was also exiled. He was cast out, though he retained his shape, doomed to wander the shadows of the plains, forever plotting against his father. And then there was Eilistrae. The Dark Maiden wept before her father. She had been the instrument of his near death. Though Senine testified to her innocence, stating that her intent was pure, Eilistrae felt the weight of the arrow. Moreover, she looked at the mortal world. She saw the dark elves of Ilithia, the people who looked like her mother, the people who were now being corrupted by the very evil Eroshni had unleashed. She knew that with Eroshni gone to the abyss, the dark elves would be pulled down with her. They would have no light. They would be slaves to the Spider Queen. So, Eilistrae made a choice that defines the tragic nobility of the Drow pantheon. She refused to stay in Arvandor. She chose self-exile. She told her father that she would go into the darkness with her brother's people. She would be the faint light in the gloom, the reminder that redemption was possible. She walked away from paradise to save the souls of the damned. This divine catastrophe explains the Fourth Crown War on Toril. The corruption of the Ilithiuri was not just a slide into bad habits. It was a reflection of their patron goddess falling into the abyss. As Eroshni became Lore, the Ilithiuri began to worship her in her new terrible form. The Spider Queen, now established in the demon web pits, reached out to the matrons of Ilithir. She promised them the power to destroy the Vaishantar, but the price was absolute obedience. The web of Eroshni was complete. The Dark Elves were no longer just a political faction. They were the chosen of Lolth. The transformation from Esratel Quasir Dark Elves to Darrow traitors was spiritual before it was physical. As we close this section, visualize the heavens quieting after the battle. Corellan sits on his throne, alone. The space beside him is empty. His daughter is gone. His son is gone. His wife is a demon. The sorrow of the Seldarine is immense, and that sorrow is about to turn into a final, terrible judgment upon the mortal world. The gods have cleaned their own house. Now they must clean Faerûn. The time for the descent is at hand. The Ilithiri are about to be physically marked for the sins of their goddess and their own atrocities. The sun is setting on the era of the Dark Elves. The night of the Drow is about to begin. The silence that follows the banishment of a god is heavy. It is a silence that presses against the eardrums, a vacuum where divine light used to be. We are suspended in that moment, between the celestial judgment of Eroshni and the mortal execution of that judgment upon Toril. We stand now at the precipice of the single most defining biological and cultural event in Elven history. It is the year -10,000 Doctor. The Crown Wars have raged for 3,000 years. Entire generations have lived and died knowing nothing but the clash of steel and the roar of magic. The geography of Faerûn has been scarred beyond recognition. The High Moor festers, the Keltermere forests are ash, and in the south, the Elithieri, fueled by the madness of their demon packs and the dark whispers of the Spider Queen, are preparing for a final surge that could swallow the North whole. The Seldarine, gathered in the twilight of Arvandor, looked down upon the world. Corellon Lorethian, his heart hardened by the betrayal of his wife and son, saw the truth. He saw that the Elithieri people had become a conduit for the Abyss. It was no longer just a war between elves. It was an infection. The chaotic evil of the demons was bleeding into the material plane through the souls of the Dark Elves. If left unchecked, this corruption would not only destroy the Vaishanta, who, despite their tyranny, were still children of the light, but it would unravel the weave itself. The decision was made. It was not made in anger, but in a cold, terrible sorrow. The rot had to be cut out to save the tree. The intervention of the Seldarine was not a bolt of lightning. It was a fundamental rewriting of nature. It was a curse, yes, but it was also a branding. Corellon decreed that those who had turned their faces to the darkness would be made to wear it forever. They would be stripped of the sun's favor. They would be marked as Daruel, traitor. On Toril, the day began like any other in the sweltering jungles of Ilithia. The armies were mustering. The Balers were barking orders in the guttural tongue of the Abyss. The matron mothers were offering sacrifices to Lolth, their knives wet with blood. Then, the lights changed. It wasn't the darkening of a storm, nor the eclipse of a moon. It was a shift in the quality of the sunlight itself. To the sun elves and moon elves in the north, the sun felt warmer, purer, a reaffirmation of their bond with the upper planes. But to the Elithieri, the sun suddenly felt hostile. Imagine standing in the market square of Atornish. You look up, and the sun is no longer a golden friend. It is a searing, accusatory eye. It begins to burn, not a sunburn of the skin, but a burning of the blood. A fever swept through the entire nation of Ilithia simultaneously. Every elf with Elithieri blood, from the high matrons in the palaces to the lowliest scouts in the field, fell to their knees, clutching their heads. The magic of the Seldarine worked through the bloodlines. It hunted down the demonic taint that Wendenai had cultivated, and where it found that taint, it twisted the vessel to match the soul. The transformation was agonizingly swift. Witness the horror of it. The rich mahogany and obsidian hues of the dark elf's skin were drained of all warmth. The color leached away, replaced by the absolute black of the void, or a deep, bruised purple like the night sky without stars. It was the color of the Underdark, the color of places where the sun never reaches. Their hair, which had often been silver or pale gold, bleached white, not the white of age, but the white of bone, the white of a spider's web. But the most terrifying change was in the eyes. The warm ambers, greens, and violets of the surface elves boiled away. In their place, the eyes of the Elithieri turned red, a glowing, infrared red, that could see in the dark but flinched in the light. It was the predator's gaze. It was the mark of the enemy. The psychological shock was absolute. The Elithari looked at their hands, their reflections, and saw monsters. They screamed, but their voices had changed too, taking on a harsher, more sibilant edge. The curse did not discriminate. This is the tragedy that Illustre wept for. It struck the innocent alongside the guilty. The children who had never sacrificed to a demon, the farmers who merely tilled the soil, the artists who secretly prayed to the old gods. They were all Elithari. They all carried the blood. And so, they all changed. The Seldarine's judgment was collective. It was a statement that the nation of Elithia had forfeited its right to walk in the light. The immediate military consequence was the collapse of the Elithari war machine. How can you fight when your body is rebelling against the very environment? The Elithari warriors on the front lines dropped their weapons. Blinded by the daylight, the sun, once their source of life, was now an agonizing torment. They scrambled for the shade. They fled into the caves. They retreated under the canopy of the deepest jungles, wrapping themselves in cloaks, wailing in pain and confusion. The demons, seeing their servants crippled, were thrown into disarray. The connection to the abyss flickered. The pacts that relied on the dark elves were now bound to these new creatures, these Drow. The change disrupted the magical frequencies the high mages relied upon. The great spells of assault crumbled. In the north, the Vaishanta commanders watched in stunned silence. They saw the opposing army dissolve. They saw the terrifying warriors of the south fall writhing to the ground. They did not understand what was happening, only that the favor of the gods had shifted. But Corellan's curse was not just physical. It was geographical. The banishing was literal. The Drow found that they could no longer find peace on the surface. The wind felt too thin. The open sky felt like a crushing weight. They felt a supernatural pull, a magnetic drag in their bones, calling them downward. The earth itself seemed to open for them. The great cavern entrances of the Underdark, previously avoided or guarded, now felt like sanctuary. The cool, stale air of the deep earth smelled like home. This was the turning. The Elithari were no more. In a matter of days, a civilization that had stood for 10,000 years was erased, replaced by a race of exile. The Seldarine had saved the world from the abyss, but they had created a permanent shadow. By casting the Drow into the dark, they ensured that the darkness would have a shape, a name, and a civilization of its own. The emotional toll on the other elven subraces was complex. For the Sun Elves of Arivandar, this was vindication. They pointed to the black skin of the Drow and said, "See, we were right. They were monsters all along. Their outer form now matches their inner darkness. It fueled their sense of superiority, their belief that they were the only true guardians of the Telquesir. For the Green Elves and Moon Elves, it was a source of deep sorrow and fear. They saw their cousins twisted into nightmares. They realized that the gods were not just benevolent parents. They were judges who held the power of unmaking. And what of the Drow themselves? As the pain of the transformation subsided, it was replaced by a cold, crystalline hatred. They knew who had done this. They knew it was Corellan. They felt his rejection in every ray of sunlight that burned their skin. They felt the loss of their beauty, their connection to the green world. And in that void of loss, Lolth whispered, she was there, in the darkness of their minds, waiting. She told them that Corellan was a tyrant. She told them that he was jealous of their strength. She told them that the surface world was weak, soft, and unworthy of them. She offered them a new kingdom. A kingdom where the sun would never burn them. A kingdom where power was the only law. "Come down," she whispered. "Come to me, come to the deep." The Fourth Crown War ended not with a treaty, but with a disappearance. The Drow armies did not surrender, they vanished. They took their families, their wealth, their slaves, and their hatred, and they began the long descent. This moment, minus 10,000 Octa, marks the end of the Elithiri Empire, and the beginning of the Underdark civilizations. It is the pivot point of the script of history. Before this, the Underdark was the realm of Mind Flayers, Aboleth, and Dwarves. Now, it was about to become the realm of the Drow. As we prepare to follow them into the dark, take a moment to appreciate the magnitude of this tragedy. A race was not born evil. They were made evil by war, by bad leadership, by divine manipulation, and finally, by a curse that left them no other choice. The Drow are the ultimate survivors, but they paid for their survival with their humanity. The surface of Faerûn is quiet now. The demons are banished or fled. The jungles of the south are empty, save for the ruins of great stone cities that are already being reclaimed by the vines. But the war is not over. It has simply changed venues. The descent is about to begin. We will follow the refugees into the bowels of the earth, where they will face horrors that make the Crown Wars look like a skirmish. We will see the founding of Talantiwar, and the civil wars that followed, even in the depths. The story continues in the dark. Let the warmth of the sun fade from your memory, that golden heat, which once nourished the skin of the Elithiri, is now a distant, painful enemy. Imagine instead the cool, damp embrace of stone. The air here is still, recycled by ancient fungal forests and vast subterranean lakes. It smells of musk, wet limestone, and the metallic tang of blood. We are following the dark elves into the deep. We are witnessing the descent. The year is minus 10,000. The turning of the Seldarine has marked the Elithiri as Drow. The surface world, once their hunting ground, has become a realm of torment. The sun burns their sensitive eyes. The open sky feels like an exposed nerve, driven by the curse of Corellon and the whispers of Lolth. An entire civilization begins to migrate downward. This was not a parade. It was a frantic, terrified exodus. Imagine the chaos in the southern jungles, the great cities of Ilithia, Atornish, Miarital, the outposts in the Valashan, were abandoned in a matter of weeks. The Drow took what they could carry: weapons, spellbooks, religious idols, and slaves. They left behind the palaces of their ancestors, the observatories where they had once charted the stars, and the gardens that would soon be reclaimed by the jungle. They poured into the caverns. The entrances to the Underdark in Faerûn are many, but the Drow sought the largest, deepest rifts in the earth, primarily beneath the Nullwatch Mountains and the Shah. Passage of the Underdark is not merely a change of location, it is a change of reality. The Underdark, or Deep Earth, is a world of verticality and darkness. There is no horizon, there is only the tunnel ahead, and the drop beside you. For the Drow, this transition was physically grueling. Their bodies were still adapting to the curse. Their eyes, now glowing with infrared heat sight, had to learn to interpret the gloom. They had to learn that in the Underdark, silence is more valuable than gold. On the surface, a shouting army commands respect. In the Underdark, a shouting army is a dinner bell for predators. And the Underdark was not empty. The Drow were not discovering a new land. They were invading an old one. The deep earth was the domain of ancient, terrifying powers. The Mind Flayers Illithids ruled vast empires of thralls in the lower dark. The Aboleths dreamt their mad dreams in the sunless sea. And most immediately, there were the dwarves. The Dwarven Empire of Shanatar was at its zenith during this era. The Shield Dwarves held the upper and middle caverns of the southwest. They were masters of stone, steel, and rune magic. When the Drow flood poured into their tunnels, the dwarves did not welcome them. They saw a horde of surface elves, twisted by dark magic, trespassing in the deep realm. The wars that followed were claustrophobic and brutal. These were battles fought in tunnels, no wider than a wagon, where numbers meant nothing and position meant everything. The Drow, desperate and cornered, fought with the ferocity of rats in a trap. They used their levitation magic, a gift from their noble bloodlines, to attack from the ceiling stalactites. They used the darkness itself, extinguishing the dwarven torches and slaughtering them in the pitch black. It was during these initial years of the descent that the Drow military doctrine was refined. They abandoned the open field tactics of the Crown Wars. They learned to fight in 3 dimensions. They learned to use poison, harvested from the giant spiders and scorpions of the deep, to debilitate the sturdy dwarven constitutions. But the external enemies were only half the threat. The internal threat was far greater. The descent shattered the political cohesion of the Illithiri Empire. On the surface, they had a centralized hierarchy. In the chaos of the tunnels, that hierarchy collapsed. Noble houses turned on one another. Without the abundance of resources found on the surface, they fought over water, over fungal groves, over safe caverns. The weak were culled. This was the beginning of the survival of the fittest mentality that defines Drow culture. Lolth, watching from the abyss, encouraged this infighting. She taught them that chaos was the ladder. If a matron mother could not hold her tunnel against her rival, she did not deserve to live. However, amidst this chaos, a semblance of order began to form beneath the lands of the Shah. The refugees coalesced into a massive subterranean civilization known as Talantiwa. Talantiwa was not a single city, but a network of conquered caverns and dwarven holds that the Drow seized and repurposed. It became the capital of the refugees in the south. Here, the Drow attempted to rebuild the grandeur they had lost. They carved palaces out of stalagmites. They used magic to create fairy firelights to replace the stars. It was in Talantiwa that the worship of Lolth became absolute. The Spider Queen appeared to her high priestesses and laid down the way of Lolth. She taught them that they were the superior race, the only ones with the strength to survive the dark. She taught them that the surface elves were weak, soft children who needed the sun to survive, while the Drow were forged in the crucible of the earth. This religious indoctrination was crucial. It transformed the descent from a punishment into a destiny. The Drow stopped seeing themselves as cursed exiles and started seeing themselves as the rightful rulers of the Underdark. But the Drow were not the only elves to flee underground. We must not forget the dark elves of Miaratar and other smaller enclaves who had been caught in the crossfire. Not all of them worshipped Lolth. Some clung to the worship of Faerûn, the Mask Lord who encouraged males to rise up and serve his raids. Others whispered prayers to Illustrae, the Dark Maiden, hoping for a path back to the light. This religious schism created immense tension within Talantiwa. The Lolthite priestesses, emboldened by their goddess's favor, began a purge. They hunted down the worshippers of other gods. This religious civil war within the dark would eventually lead to the fragmentation of Talantiwa and the spreading of the Drow across the entire Underdark of Faerûn. Let us look back at the surface for a moment. With the Drow gone, the lands of Ilithia fell silent. The jungle reclaimed the stone. The vast empire that had sparked the Crown Wars was effectively erased. The Vaishanta Empire in the north declared victory. They claimed they had driven the darkness from the world, but they were wrong. They had not destroyed the darkness. They had simply pressurized it. By minus 9600 Doctor, 4 centuries after the descent, the Drow had stabilized. They had established a foothold. They had pushed the dwarves of Shanatar back, taking key trade routes. They had enslaved thousands of goblins, orcs, and kobolds to serve as fodder and labor. The culture of the Drow had ossified into the terrifying form we recognize today. The matriarchy was absolute, as Lolth decreed that only females could fully channel her divine power. The males were relegated to soldiers and consorts, expendable and subservient. Trust was non-existent. Paranoia was a virtue. The Drow began to experiment with the magic of the Underdark. They discovered Faerûn, a magical radiation unique to the deep earth. They learned to use it to power their cities and their items. However, items created with Faerûn would disintegrate if exposed to sunlight, further binding the Drow to the dark. The descent also changed their biology further. Their lifespans, while still elven, shortened slightly due to the violence of their society. Their birth rates dropped, making every child a valuable commodity to be indoctrinated and used by the house. One specific event during this period illustrates the Drow mindset perfectly. The Wars of the Spider Queen. Around minus 9000 Doctor, the Great Cavern of Talantiwa collapsed. Both politically and physically, the fighting between the noble houses became so intense, and the magical discharges so volatile, that the ceiling of the Great Cavern gave way. Thousands died. Did the Drow mourn? Did they band together to rebuild? No. The survivors saw this as a sign that they should spread out. The great diaspora of the Drow began. Powerful matron mothers took their houses and marched into the dark to found their own cities. This is how the great city-states of the Underdark were born and Enduduth. The temple city of Lolth was founded deep beneath the Kalimshan region. Merimidra was established beneath the Daylands. And eventually, thousands of years later, a noble house led by a matriarch named Menzabara, the Kinless would found Menzabaranzan. But in this era, the era of the descent, the Drow were still a raw wound on the world. They were lashing out at everything. They launched the first raids back to the surface. Imagine the terror of the surface. It is a moonless night in the forest of Tethia. Suddenly, the ground opens up. Silent, black-skinned warriors emerge, wielding swords of adamantine and poison. They strike without warning, dragging screaming captives back into the holes in the earth, before vanishing. The Crown Wars had formally ended with the descent, but the war of light and darkness had just begun. The Drow had become the bogeymen of the Elven race. They were the monster under the bed, the shadow in the corner. The psychological impact of the descent on the Drow cannot be overstated. They were a people who had lost everything: their home, their gods, their sun, and their beauty. In return, they gained power. But it was a cold, lonely power. They were alone in the dark, with only a mad goddess for company. As we conclude this section on the descent, visualize the map of Faerûn. On the surface, the green forests are slowly healing. The sun shines, but underneath, like a rot in the bone, a vast network of purple-lit cities is spreading. The Drow are multiplying, they are plotting, and they have a long, long memory. The Vaishentar Empire, on the surface, believes the war is over. They believe they have won, but they are about to discover that their own hubris has not gone unnoticed. The final phase of the Crown Wars does not involve the Drow. It involves the collapse of the victors. The High Mages of Arivandar have held power for too long. The rot is not just in the Underdark. It is in the high towers of the sun. The Fifth Crown War is coming, and it will be a war of liberation against the very empire that started it all. The caverns of the Underdark have swallowed the Drow, and the heavy stone doors of the deep have slammed shut. We return now to the surface, to the world of wind and sky. Take a moment to readjust your senses. Let the oppressive weight of the subterranean dark lift from your shoulders. Feel the warmth of the sun again. But notice that it feels different now. It is no longer the innocent morning sun of the first flowering. It is an old sun shining down on a scarred world. The year is roughly minus 9,200. Doctor, the Drow are gone, banished to the dark. The other great threats, the dragons of the south, the raw chaos of the primitive human tribes, are quiet. And standing alone, straddling the northern world like a colossus of gold and marble, is the Vaishentar Empire. To the casual observer, this would look like the moment of ultimate victory for Arivandar. They had defeated Miritar. They had outlasted Ilithir. They had absorbed Chantal Othraia and Keltormir. They were the undisputed masters of elven kind. Their coronal, a puppet of the Vaishentar noble house, sat upon the golden throne in the high forest, ruling over a contiguous empire that stretched from the spine of the world to the high moor. But empires are like living organisms. When they stop growing, they begin to die. And when they consume poison, the poison of tyranny, of genocide, of moral compromise, that death comes from within. The Fifth Crown War is not a war of invasion. It is a war of dissolution. It is the story of how the Telquasia finally woke up from the trance of Vishantar supremacy and realized that their saviors were actually their jailers. Post-descent, Arivandar was a terrifying place. In the vacuum left by the war with the Drow, the Vaishentar tightened their grip. They became paranoid. They saw enemies everywhere. They believed that the corruption that had taken the Dark Elves might be hiding in the hearts of the Moon Elves, or the Green Elves under their command. They established a police state, the Akvalar. The army was deployed not to the borders, but to the cities. They patrolled the streets of the annexed provinces, enforcing strict curfews. They banned the worship of any deity other than the state's Eldarin, a sanitized version of the pantheon that emphasized hierarchy and obedience to the coronal. The High Mages of Arivandar, once the pinnacle of magical research, became inquisitors. They used mind-reading spells to scan the thoughts of the populace. If a noble in occupied Chantal Othraia harbored resentment against the Golden Throne, They would vanish in the night, their mind wiped or their body imprisoned in a gem. This period is known as the Vaishantar drift. It was a stagnation of the soul. Art became repetitive and soulless, serving only to glorify the state. Innovation died because new ideas were seen as dangerous. But you cannot suppress the spirit of the elves forever. Corellon created them to be free, to be chaotic and variable like the wind. The rigid order of the Vaishantar was anathema to the very biology of the race. The spark of the final war was struck in the east. Far to the east of the high forest lay the great woodland of Arkara. The great king forest. This is the land you know today as Cormanthor, the home of the future myth Dratana. In this era, it was a wild, untamed frontier. During the darkest days of the Crown Wars, refugees from all the fallen nations had fled here. Moon elves from Orishar, green elves from Mirita, and Chantal Othria, and even disillusioned sun elves, who could no longer stomach the cruelty of their own kin. They gathered under the massive oaks and shadow tops of Arkara. They formed a loose coalition. They did not call it an empire. They called it the Elven Court. The Elven Court was everything Eravandar was not. It was a democracy of sorts, a council where the voices of all the subraces were heard. They lived in harmony with the woods, not dominating them. They worshipped the Seldarine in the old ways, with joy and spontaneity. For centuries, the Vaishantar ignored the Elven Court. They viewed it as a refugee camp, a collection of beggars and cowards hiding in the woods. But as the tyranny in the west grew unbearable, more and more elves slipped through the Vaishantar dragnets and fled east. The Elven Court grew. It became a symbol. It became a hope. In -9200, the Vaishantar Empire decided that this hope was dangerous. The Coronal of Eravandar issued a decree. The Elven Court was an illegal gathering. It was a harbor for dissidents and traitors. He demanded that the leaders of the court surrender themselves to Vaishantar justice, and that the population of Arkara submit to annexation. The messengers who brought this decree to the Elven Court were not met with fear. They were met with a unified wall of shields. The Elven Court refused. And so, the Golden Army marched east. The Fifth Crown War, often called the War of the Elven Court, was different from the previous four. It was not a war of annihilation. It was a war of ideology. When the Vaishantar legions entered the woods of Arkara, they found that they were not fighting a conventional enemy. They were fighting a population that had nothing left to lose. The defenders of the Elven Court used the dense forest to nullify the Vaishantar heavy infantry. They used high magic not to destroy, but to confuse, turning paths back on themselves, creating illusions of vast armies, putting entire battalions to sleep. But the true turning point happened back in the west, in the heart of Eravandar itself. The marching of the army to the east left the core of the empire exposed, and the people were tired. They were so incredibly tired. 3,000 years of war, millions of lives lost. For what? To police a forest across the continent. A rebellion began to simmer in the high forest. It started in the universities and the temples. Young sun elves, reading the forbidden histories of the first flowering, realized that their ancestors had been wrong. They realized that the Vaishantar family had hijacked their culture. The pivotal moment came when the high mages of the Elven Court did something extraordinary. They did not cast a fireball, they cast ascending. Working together, In a great circle in the heart of Cormanthor, they wove a spell of communication that rippled across the entire continent. It bypassed the Vaishantar censorship wards. It spoke directly into the minds of the elves in Arivanda. It did not preach hate, it simply showed the truth. It projected images of the peace in the elven court. It showed elves of all nations living together without fear. It asked a simple question: is this war yours, or is it theirs? The spell broke the psychological hold of the Vaishantar. The illusion of necessity shattered. In the capital of Arivanda, the streets erupted. This was not an invasion, it was a revolution. The common people, the merchants, and even members of the minor nobility rose up. They stormed the crystalline citadels of the Vaishantar overlord. The civil war was brief but intense. The coronel tried to order the remaining home guard to massacre the protesters. But the soldiers lowered their spears. They too had brothers and sisters dying in the fruitless wars. The fall of the Vaishantar was swift. The ruling family, seeing the tide turn, attempted to flee, perhaps to regroup in some hidden fortress or to barter with the dragons. But they were intercepted. They were not killed by a mob, but arrested by a coalition of their own generals and high priests. The Vaishantar Empire was formally dissolved in the year -9000. The collapse was total. The central government evaporated. The provinces of Shantal Othraya, Miarita, and Keltomir were declared free. The golden throne was left empty, a symbol of hubris that no elf wanted to sit upon. The relief that washed over Faerûn was palpable. It was like a fever breaking. The long nightmare of the Crown Wars, which had consumed the elven race for 3 millennia, was finally over. But the cost was incalculable. Look at the map of the north in this moment of victory. It is a broken puzzle, a Rivendell, once the shining jewel, fractured into several smaller, independent realms. The High Forest remained a stronghold of the Sun Elves, but they were humbled, turning inward to heal their culture. This region would eventually evolve into the realm of Eolan and others. Miarital was still a wasteland, the High Moor a permanent scar reminding them of the dark disaster. Ilithia was a haunted ruin, the jungle swallowing the stone. Keltomir was a fragmented collection of city-states, its great canopy burned away. The Fifth Crown War taught the elves a lesson they would never forget. There can be no single elven empire. The dream of unification was a lie. The Telquasir were too diverse, too magical, and too chaotic to be ruled by one hand. The survivors of the collapse began a great migration. Many, sickened by the bloodshed of the mainland, looked to the sea, they looked to the west, they remembered the ancient legends of a place prepared for them by the Seldarine, a refuge where no war could touch them. They began to dream of Evermeet. Others, those who still believed in the potential of Faerûn, gathered in the elven court. They swore an oath, the Cormanthor Compact. They swore that never again would elf kill elf. They swore that they would build a society based on the union of the subraces, not the dominance of one. This would plant the seeds for the greatest civilization of the next age, Mythdrana. But that is a story for the future. Here, in the year -9000, we stand amidst the rubble of the past. The Crown Wars have ended. The elves have survived, but they are changed. They are no longer the innocent children of the first flowering. They are scarred veterans. They are a people who have looked into the abyss of their own nature and barely stepped back in time. The gods, too, were quiet. Corellon had saved them from the Drow, but he could not save them from themselves. That was something they had to do on their own. As the dust settles on the collapsed spires of Arivandar, a new feeling enters the world. It is a feeling of melancholy, of a retreat. The elves begin to realize that perhaps their time as the absolute masters of Toril is ending. Humans are spreading in the south. Dwarves are expanding in the deeps. The world is moving on. The final chapter of our saga awaits. We must look at the immediate aftermath, the founding of the refuge, and the legacy that these wars left on the psychology of the Forgotten Realms. We must understand why, 10,000 years later, an elf still flinches at the sight of a spider, and why the ruins of the High Forest still whisper of betrayal. The wars are done. The wandering is about to begin. The dust has settled. The screams of the dying, which echoed for 3,000 years, have finally faded into the wind. We stand now in the quiet aftermath of the Crown Wars, looking out over a world that has been fundamentally broken and remade. We have walked a long road together, you and I. We have seen the golden arrogance of Arivandar, the burning tragedy of Miarito, the corruption of the Drow, and the final collapse of the great empires. Now, in this final chapter, we must examine what rose from the ashes. We must understand how the trauma of this era shaped the psychology of the elves for the next 10,000 years, and how it paved the way for the world we know today. The immediate period following the fall of the Vaishantar Empire, starting around -9000 Doctor, is known to historians as the Wandering Year. It is a poetic name, but the reality was one of profound collective PTSD. Imagine a race of people who have realized that their greatest strength, their magic and their civilization, is also their greatest danger. The survivors of the Crown Wars looked at the ruins of their white cities, the toppled spires, and the magical scars on the land, and they felt a deep, revulsive shame. They decided that civilization itself was the trap. For thousands of years, the elves of Faerûn largely abandoned the concept of nation-states. They did not build new capitals. They did not raise armies. Instead, they wandered. They lived in small, mobile clans, moving with the seasons, treading lightly on the earth. They returned to a primal existence, fearful that if they gathered in large numbers, the madness of the Vaishantar or the corruption of the Ilithii would return. This era cemented the cultural divide between the elven subraces that persists to this day. The green elves or wild elves retreated deepest into the forests. They looked at the sun elves with suspicion and anger. They blamed the high magic and the city building of the north for the destruction of the world. They became isolationists, the fierce guardians of the woods who would shoot intruders on sight. They abandoned the written word for the oral tradition, believing that records and laws were just tools for tyrants. The moon elves took a different path. They became the glue of the world. They wandered the most widely, traveling between the scattered settlements. They were the ones who kept the lines of communication open. They were the ones who later befriended the rising race of humans, teaching them the basics of magic and civilization, hoping to guide these short-lived people away from the mistakes the elves had made. And the sun elves, the haughty Telquesir, they were humbled but not broken. They retreated to the few remaining strongholds, like the high forest and the distant secret places. They turned inward, obsessing over the preservation of their history, vowing to be the curators of the past, so that the Crown Wars would never be repeated. But their arrogance remained, tempered now by a melancholic bitterness. They saw themselves as the martyrs of history, the ones who bore the burden of leadership that the lesser elves could not understand. But the most significant legacy of this post-war clarity was the creation of the ultimate sanctuary, the creation of Evermeet. While the concept of a refuge had existed for some time, it was the horror of the Crown Wars that made it a necessity. Around -9800 Dr. during the height of the conflict, and continuing into the Wandering Years, the High Mages of the surviving nations performed a ritual that rivals the Dark Disaster in power, but opposes it in intent. They did not destroy land, they summoned it. Using the highest of high magic, they severed a piece of Arvandor, the divine realm of the Seldarim, and bridged it with the material plane of Toril. They created an island in the trackless sea, far to the west of Faerûn. Visualize Evermeet. It is not just an island. It is a physical manifestation of elven longing. It is a place where the trees are taller and greener than anywhere on the mainland. It is a place where magic flows like water, where time moves differently. It is a paradise of gleaming towers, crystal bridges, and eternal song. The founding of Evermeet created the concept of the retreat. It planted a seed in the soul of every elf born on Faerûn, a deep spiritual pull to the west, a feeling that Toril is not their true home, that they are merely travelers here, and that peace can only be found by sailing over the horizon to the Green Isle. This psychological safety valve is what allowed the elven race to survive. Without Evermeet, the despair of the Crown Wars might have led to their extinction. Knowing that there was a safe harbor, a place where the Drow could not reach, and where the wars of men could not touch them, gave them the strength to endure. However, the creation of Evermeet also marked the beginning of the end for elven dominance on Faerûn. By creating a separate heaven, they detached themselves from the earth. They began to view the mainland as a temporary, dirty place. This detachment left a vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. While the elves wandered and mourned, while the Drow built their nightmares in the dark, and while the High Mages sealed themselves in their towers, a new sound began to rise in the fertile valleys of the Sword Coast and the Narrow Sea. The sound of hammers, the sound of short, ambitious lives burning bright. Humanity was rising. The primitive human tribes, who had hidden in caves while the dragons and elves tore the sky apart, began to emerge. They saw the ruins of the elven empires not as tragedies, but as quarries. They took the stones of Ilithir and Aravandar and built their own first cities. This is the supreme irony of the Crown Wars. The elves fought for 3,000 years to determine which of them would rule the world. In doing so, they broke each other so thoroughly that they handed the world to the humans. The Empire of Netheril, which would rise a few thousand years later, was built on the magical scraps left behind by the Crown Wars. The first human wizards learned their art from the Eolan elves, the survivors of the Vaishanta collapse. The ruins of the Crown Wars provided the dungeons and the treasure troves that would fuel the age of adventurers. Let us look at the physical scars that remain on the map today, the monuments to this ancient conflict. The High Moor still sits there, a vast fog-choked plateau of acid and death. Adventurers who travel there today speak of ghosts, of ancient elven spirits that scream in the mist. They find ruins of green glass, the melted remains of Miuritari cities. It stands as a permanent reminder of the dark disaster. The Keltamir forest is gone, split into the forest of Tethir and the Snakewood, separated by the trade routes of Ammon. If you walk in the deep woods of Tethir, you might find ancient stone markers, overgrown with moss, bearing the star and moon crest of Keltamai, memorials to the dragonfires. And beneath your feet, always beneath your feet, is the Underdark. The Drow are there. They are the dark reflection of the surface. Every time an adventurer fights a Drow raider, every time a city on the surface fears the night, it is a ripple from the stone thrown 10,000 years ago. The Crown Wars created the Drow. Lolth's dominion is the shadow cast by the Vaishantar's light. Even the magic of the realms was changed. The Seldarine and the goddess Mystra altered the way magic works to prevent another dark disaster. High magic, the Arsalutel quest, became harder to cut, requiring more participants and carrying deadlier risks. The gods effectively put a safety lock on the weave to stop the elves from breaking reality again. So, what is the final lesson of the Crown Wars? It is a lesson about the fragility of perfection. The first flowering was a golden age, a paradise. But paradise is static. It cannot grow. It took the breaking of the world to create the dynamic, dangerous and diverse realms we know today. The elves lost their innocence. They lost their unity. They lost their empire. But in exchange they gained wisdom. They became the elders of the world, the sad guardians who watched the younger races and say, "Be careful. We walked this path, and it leads to fire. And it leads." Visualizing the timeline we have traversed, feel the weight of those 12,000 years. From the first arrogant decree of the Vaishantar to the final boat sailing for Evermeet. From the sun-drenched spires of Arivanda to the purple-lit caverns of Menzoberranzan. It is a story of pride, a story of tragedy, but ultimately it is a story of survival. The Telquesir are still here. They are diminished, yes. They are sadder, yes, but they are still the people, and as long as the stars shine over Faerûn, they will remember. And now you remember too. You are now a keeper of the law. You carry the history of the Crown Wars with you. This brings us to the end of our journey through the ancient conflict that split the elves. It has been a long road, and I thank you for walking it with me. If you found peace in this story, or if the tragedy of the elves touched your heart, please leave a like on this video. It helps more than you know. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. There are many more stories hidden in the archives of the Forgotten Realms. Tales of Netheril, of the fall of Myth Drana, of the time of troubles. We have only just scratched the surface. Until next time, may your own history be one of peace, and may you always find a safe harbor in the storm. Farewell.